This lecture focuses on the very first political parties in America and some of the arguments that were happening because of or between them. Then issues that were happening in Europe really started to separate these two parties, the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. And one of those things that happened soon after George Washington was inaugurated as our first president. The French Revolution started in 1789, and at that point, almost all Americans were totally for it. They supported this revolution. It felt like the same thing they had just gone through. Like the people of the country fighting for their freedoms, fighting for their liberty, fighting for the exact same ideals that they had just fought a war over. And so that happened. Then about 4 years later, in the spring of 1793, a group of radicals took control of France and started to execute thousands of people. These people that were kind of the fancy rich people that had been in charge before were being executed. Their heads were being cut off by guillotine. Okay, and so it's kind of crazy here. So a lot of people started to back off and say, ooh, I don't know if I could support this anymore. But a lot of the Democratic Republicans still did support this because they said, even though we don't necessarily agree with the way they're doing it, they are fighting for liberty. They are fighting for what's important, and the power should be in the hands of the people. And so all this is happening, and then France decides to declare war on Britain. Okay, and then President Washington and the American people found themselves in a really, really tricky situation where a lot of people didn't agree with what France was doing. It was a whole new government from the one that we had just been working with to win the war and kind of be allies with them. And so we were trading with both the British and the French, but we had made a treaty in 1778 with the old French government that said that we would help to defend those French colonies that were in the Caribbean if they needed them. So if Britain was going to attack those areas, we promised that we would help defend them. And so that was kind of tricky. So how can we stay neutral if one of them was kind of our allies? But Washington really, really wanted to. George Washington really wanted to stay neutral. He did not like the idea of getting involved in other countries' problems. Okay, and so he declared in April of 1793 that the United States will be friendly and impartial to the two countries. So they would not take either side, and they will be friendly and continue to trade with both sides. So the issues with Great Britain started to get really, really bad at this point. Congress actually got really, really close to declaring war in 1794. Because there were a couple things that the British were doing. They were intercepting every single ship that was heading into French ports and taking them over, taking them into, taking the goods and whatever, imprisoning the people. And a lot of these ships were American ships. Like hundreds of American ships were being intercepted by the British. So that was making the people of America mad. Why are you doing this to us? We're impartial. We're on both sides. Okay. And so the other thing that was happening is the British, we talked about before, were still in those forts out on the edge of America. Even though they weren't supposed to be, they had kept those forts because the Articles of Confederation didn't have the power to stop them. But they were still in those forts, and they were all of a sudden now inciting native attacks. So they were whipping up the natives and instigating them to come in and attack the United States, the western part of the United States. And so, Washington really didn't want a brand new war here. It's too expensive, too much. We just didn't want to be fighting a war between France and Britain. That wasn't any of our business. And so John Jay was sent to Britain to come up with the treaty. And he did, but the British really kind of drove a hard bargain, and it's definitely a pro-British treaty. It's way more on their side than it is on the American side. And so here's what it said. Jay's treaty was signed, and it said that Britain had the right to seize cargo headed to French ports. So if we were sending something to France, then they could stop our ships and take the stuff. However, Britain, in order to have a treaty here, said they will give up all of those forts that are out in America and completely abandon that area. Okay, and they also said that America will become a most favored nation. And a most favored nation is just a term that we use in trading and economics. Okay, most favored nation just means that it's your policy, it's essentially a policy title that makes sure that trading is fair between the countries. So no crazy tariffs or crazy rules that are stopping fairness from happening. And so this very pro-British treaty came back to Washington's desk, and he really did not want to sign it, but he did sign it in order to avoid war, because he knew that the economy was still really, really brand new and fragile, and they had all the debt from the previous war, and he just didn't want to get involved in that and possibly destroy the entire country, this baby country, the United States of America. So he signed this to avoid war and stop that from happening. Jay's Treaty did have some really positive effects for the United States, though. In 1795, Spain had joined France in the war against Great Britain. So they had picked a side and they were fighting with France against Great Britain. And they were afraid that when the Jay's Treaty was signed, that meant the United States was going to join Britain against France, and then they would be at war against Spain as well, okay? And so they thought, if that happens, then the United States is going to come in and take all of our area, all of our land in North America, and we don't want to give that up. Okay, that's too much. This Florida area was theirs, as you can see in blue here, okay, or green, or whatever you want to call that color. And then all of this territory to the west of the Mississippi River was all part of Spain. And so they agreed that instead of this possibly happening, they said, you know what, just to show that we're still friends with you, we want to negotiate all of these issues that we have where we're not sure who belong or who gets what. All right, so there were all this fighting over land, especially that was right in here. Okay, in that area, both Spain and the United States kind of thought they deserved it. It was actually, sorry, probably about here, this area. Okay, and so they agreed to negotiate all these issues, and Pinckney's Treaty is what came of it. Pinckney's Treaty gave the United States the right to a lot of this land. They were just given this land, okay? And then it also gave them the right to navigate the Mississippi River, to use this river all the way down, not being bugged by the Spanish at all. And it gave them the right to, let me erase so we can see. Okay, and it gave them the right to deposit goods and use New Orleans as a port. So now all of these farms who are dotted in here, who have a hard time getting their goods all the way out to the coast to ship it out, can just throw it on a riverboat, go right down the river, deposit their stuff here, get into ships, and go across the ocean to sell to Europeans. Take a moment to write out your answer to this question. At this time in history, people started to expand out and want more land, and so they started to move west. Okay, and so they started to settle between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River in that northwest territory. All right, and so as they're going over these mountains into the Mississippi River, this is land that was previously occupied and controlled by natives, and so the natives were obviously going to fight against them. And so the Miami natives and the Shawnee natives were both groups that were fighting against them. And so originally, as people are starting to flow over, the resistance was led by this man named Chief Little Turtle of the Miami natives. And so he had been kind of leading this resistance, and the U.S. troops were sent out to shut him down in 1790. Chief Little Turtle and his troops defeated these U.S. troops in 1790 and then again in 1791. And so Washington decided, we have to shut this down. We can't be embarrassed anymore by these people. We need to get out there, stop the disasters, and send out a good seasoned general, someone who has actually been in war, to try and stop them. And so they sent General Anthony Wayne right here. Okay, and General Anthony Wayne was sent out, and he took his troops and defeated the native forces. And the native leader at that point was Chief Blue Jacket of the Shawnee, defeated him at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. At this point, this was, most of the natives had been part of this fight, And so the fact that they had been defeated by this group of United States troops meant that they pretty much had no chance of defending themselves anymore, and it kind of took all of the power away from the natives in that area in the Northwest Territory. And so 12 different native nations signed the Treaty of Greenville, Treaty of Greenville in 1795. And these 12 native nations signed up and said, we agree to give up these parts of Ohio and Indiana and all of this land that's ours and move off of it for a yearly payment of $9,500 a year. Okay, so this kind of set up to where the resistance wasn't there anymore. No one was fighting these new settlers that came in. So the settlers really started to flow out into the area, and just a short 8 years later, in 1803, Ohio had enough people in it to become another state of the United States of America. So at this point in 1796, problems really started to ratchet up with France as well. And in 1796, after 8 years of being president, George Washington stepped down as the first president of the United States. He probably could have gone for a very long time, but at this point he set a precedent that 2 terms was enough, and this was followed by almost every president after. Okay, and so when he stepped down, the Federalists threw all of their power behind John Adams, and the Democratic Republicans threw their power behind Thomas Jefferson. At this point, whoever got the most votes was going to be the president, and whoever got the second most votes total would be the vice president. So John Adams got 71 electoral votes, and Thomas Jefferson got 68. So John Adams won and became the president, and Thomas Jefferson became the vice president of the United States. So it didn't work real well having this, because the two sides that are fighting each other and angry at each other are supposed to work together, and that just didn't work out that well. And so they would change it in the future. That's going to be the 12th Amendment, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. So at this point, with Adams in charge, the French started to get a little bit handsy as well, and they started to seize goods from American ships that were headed to Britain. So if we were trading with Britain, now the French would be taking the stuff off of the ships that were headed over there to be traded, and Britain's doing the same thing to us if we're sending it to France. It's just a nightmare. And so Adams wanted to stop this as quickly as possible, and so John Adams sent people over to negotiate with France. Okay, he sent over Charles Pinckney, Elbridge Gerry, and John Marshall over to Paris to negotiate with the French government. They waited for weeks. Okay, weeks and weeks of waiting, and then all of a sudden, after being disrespected in this way, 3 French agents came up to them. When it was kind of described later on, President Adams would call the French agents Agents X, Agents Y, and Agent Z, and so that's why it's called the XYZ affair. And those 3 French agents came up and said, okay, you want to talk? You want to start this negotiation? We need a bribe of $250,000 that you're giving us, and you have to give our country a loan of $12 million. Then we'll talk to you. But until then, we're not even going to talk to you about negotiating anything. And so America said, are you kidding me? They had just been disrespected by being left there sitting for weeks, and then here they come and they say you have to give us money even just to talk to us. And the Americans refused, and a lot of Americans started to call for war. America completely cut off trade with France at this time. Okay, and there's a quote from the affair. He said, Mr. X again returned to the subject of money. Said he, gentlemen, it is expected that you will offer money. What is your answer? And we replied, it is no, not a sixpence. So that's basically saying, we're not going to give you any money. You need to talk to us because we are a powerful country, basically. And so this caused a quasi-war with France. It really wasn't a declared war or anything, but it was a battle at sea between French Navy and American Navy up until the Convention of 1800 was signed, which did 2 things. It ended this little quasi-war, this little fighting at sea thing, and it also released America from that treaty of 1778 that said we had to help them with their Caribbean colonies. Then something happened in 1798 that would really mark John Adams' career as president and kind of make it look bad. All right, it was the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. The Federalists had pushed some laws through Congress, and they had been signed by John Adams, so they happened under his presidency, and they were a set of 4 laws called the Alien and Sedition Acts. The first 3 laws were aimed at aliens, okay? Aliens is just another word for a person living in a country who is not a citizen of that country. Simple. Anyone who's not a citizen who's living in the country is an alien. Okay? And what it did for those people, number 1, the first law extended the years an immigrant had to wait to become a citizen from 5 years to 14 years. So it made it a lot harder to become a citizen. You had to be in the country, working, doing what you had to do for 14 years instead of 5. And then 2 and 3 went together to give the president these powers. And they gave the president the power to deport any alien who was, quote, dangerous to the nation without trial. So it basically let the president just get rid of anybody who was not a citizen if they thought they were dangerous for whatever reason. Okay, so we're taking away rights from people. We're not taking away rights necessarily from citizens, but a lot of people are upset because we're taking away rights that were promised in our Bill of Rights from these people. And the last law was the one that really made people mad. Okay, the last one was to prevent sedition. Sedition is a word for inciting a rebellion. Okay, so sedition is trying to get other people to rebel against whatever you want, right, against the country. And so this law said it's illegal to criticize the federal government or any government official. Now this is where it gets bad, because now it's illegal for citizens and aliens, and it doesn't matter who. You cannot say anything bad about the federal government, can't say anything bad about any government official, the president, congressman, it doesn't matter, judge, you're not allowed to say anything bad about them. That is very obviously taking away that First Amendment right. Okay, and so immediately people were very upset about it. Kentucky and Virginia jumped in first, and they both passed resolutions against it. And remember, this whole Constitution's new. This whole dealing with laws and getting them thrown out is new. And so they both had different theories. Virginia introduced a theory called interposition, and that basically says a state like Virginia can and should intervene, should get in the way, come between the federal government and the people to stop an illegal action. So if something illegal is happening, then the state can jump in and protect the people from the federal government. Okay, and that's interposition. Kentucky introduced something called nullification. This is an even bigger argument. Their theory is that states have the right to declare a federal law invalid if it's unconstitutional. So if the law goes against the Constitution, the states can say, this is gone, this is invalid, this is not a real law, goodbye. Okay, and they can completely shut it down. Take a moment to write out your answer to this question. Then the election of 1800 came in, and it was already so close between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans every time, and now John Adams had made so many people angry. He was the Federalist candidate, all right? And so he had done the Alien and Sedition Acts that we just talked about that made people angry, and then he had also imposed brand new taxes on houses and land and slaves, so he had made a lot of people angry with him, and that would no longer vote for him because he was costing them money and taking away their rights. And so Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, Thomas Jefferson as the president and Aaron Burr as the vice president, were the Democratic Republican candidates. They were against taxes, against the National Bank, against all of these different things. And so they came in ready to go to battle with John Adams. This was a very brutal mudslinging type of a election where they were saying terrible things about each other. And what ended up happening is the Democratic Republicans won, but it showed a huge flaw in the system. The previous flaw had put these two men, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, in as president and vice president that didn't get along and didn't want to work together. And so people thought, well, us electors, we get 2 votes. So instead of voting for the 2 guys that we think are the best, obviously the 2 presidents, we're going to have 1 vote for president and 1 vote for vice president. All right. But what that would do is if all Democratic Republicans voted for Jefferson as president and Burr as vice president, that would cause a tie between the two, and the House of Representatives would have to decide. So the plan was one Democratic Republican would have to withhold a vote for Burr, and then he would become the vice president. But it didn't happen. All right, nobody withheld their vote, and the two men did tie, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. So the House of Representatives was going to get to pick which one of them would be the president. And the House of Representatives was controlled by the Federalists, so they got to pick, and most of them absolutely hated Jefferson because he had been the one speaking out against them for so long. However, Alexander Hamilton hated Aaron Burr even more. They just didn't get along the entire lives. It was a lot, all right? And so Alexander Hamilton went through and convinced his people to choose Jefferson, and so Jefferson became the president, and Aaron Burr became the vice president of the United States. Now, this was a very important election. Was it really that close? No, not really. Did anything too crazy happen? No, not really. But this is the very first time when a change in power had happened from one political group to another political party. All right, and the Federalists were still in control of everything else. They were still in control of the army. They still had the presidency in John Adams, and they still had the Congress. So they could have easily gone through and completely taken over and overthrown the Constitution and kept themselves in power. But instead, what they did is they respected the people's right to pick the next president. And this set up an example for what the United States is all about, for peaceful transition of power. If the people think that we should have this transition of power that's peaceful, or think that we should have these new people in, then we're going to do that. We're going to respect their decision and do it peacefully. Take a moment to write out the 3 questions you have from the notes so far.